Thank you, Nilesh.
Okay, so Yasuhiko guided this, steered the discussion through two questions, very timely, very relevant questions. So instead of talking about the overall Bhagavad Gita, I will try to focus on those two questions um, as kind of placeholders for the conversation. Otherwise, it will become very large because it's a very big and significant scripture. But before getting into the two questions, I thought because there are many philosophically oriented people here, and it is an audience where these three paths that Srikant outlined are all convergent. It becomes important to understand how the Gita is different as a scripture from many other scriptures. In a sense, how is the Gita in some ways unique than a normal version of scripture that we know, that we may have read, that have been named here, that we have covered in classes earlier. That gives us a slightly different starting point for appreciating the Gita, which will stand us in good stead later on. The first thing is that, as is already evident, but it's useful to reiterate, that normally scriptures or teachings are delivered in a quiet and calm environment, in a monastery or in a meditation room or in a very sublime space. The Gita is not like that at all. The Gita is delivered in the middle of action, and not just ordinary action, but a battlefield in both literal and symbolic terms. It is delivered when, both in the particular as well as in the universal context, as Yasuhiko mentioned, when all knowledge and personal resources of the mental man, represented by the mental man of action, represented by Arjuna, with a sattvic disposition, and I'll define some of these terms later, begin to fail him. When all his resources, all his knowledge begins to fall short and fail him in the moment of a fairly acute existential agony and despair, with almost no standing ground left. That is the point in which the scripture is delivered. And this is of profound significance. So the Gita as a teaching is not merely dealing with a philosophical dilemma, but also a terrifyingly pragmatic one. And it is delivered when at the last frontier of a kind of paralyzing doubt in the karma yogin, which is where Arjuna begins with, and which is where the first 1/3 of the Gita deals with. As the mental man of action struggles to transcend the tangled and tortuous working of the three modes of nature. The three modes of nature, you've studied the Gita, you know what I'm talking about, but we will go to it later if necessary. So this is the first unique aspect of the Gita as a teaching, delivered in the middle of action and terrifying action. Secondly, as Srikant very rightly mentioned, it is not an impersonal sermon given to a large impersonal mass of people, but from the preceptor to a very specific individual on the foundation of an intimate personal relationship. And as again mentioned, as a dialogue, and not like many scriptures which are delivered as a monologue. So this is dialogical and therefore more contemporary in its import, given the evolution of the human civilization from a purely receptive or a passively receptive bicameral orientation to a more engaging, interested, directly participatory form of interaction. There have been others, but mostly scriptures have been delivered impersonally. The other point about this second thing is that this teaching is delivered to someone who deserves the knowledge. In the Eastern Indian tradition, there is a concept called the adhikara. Some of you, Srikant and Ambika, would know the meaning. Adhikara means that all knowledge is not made available at any point in time randomly. Only that knowledge is imparted to which you have aspired to and built a capability of receiving. And it is delivered at the opportune moment, in this particular case, when the entire ego structure of the recipient has collapsed in abject helplessness. It is not delivered when he is puffed up with his pretense of knowledge and his pretentiousness of virtue. It is delivered when he is helpless at every level of being, facing a situation of calamitous proportions in which he finds himself unable to act, let alone move. And therefore, the point is that both the timing and the personal context and the deserving nature of a very almost a hand-picked recipient is as if profoundly relevant to the import of the teaching itself. This is very, very important. Why was Arjuna chosen? There were many other great people in that age. We have read the Gita, we know of Bhishma, he was the greatest personality of the age. We know of Yudhishthira, who was the most spiritual or dharmic or pious. We know of Karna, who was equally, if not a greater warrior than Arjuna. But Arjuna is handpicked because it is as if the import of the teaching cannot be divorced from the personal characteristics of the listener or the recipient. And Arjuna was chosen because not only was he a warrior, but he had the fortitude and the rectitude to withstand the destruction of the pretense of knowledge and the pretentiousness of virtue, which was extremely painful and heartbreaking, but was necessary for his direct reception of a teaching that was meant to herald a new age in the human civilization. This is the second unique aspect of the Gita's teaching. The third, equally, if not even more important, and this refers to what Yasuhiko covered in his initial opening introduction. The Gita as a scripture is not meant to be, although some have, but it is not meant to be, in my understanding, as a hand-me-down prescription of do's and don'ts. The Gita as a scripture is not meant to be received as a hand-me-down prescription of do's and don'ts or as a representation of a static truth. The Gita is meant as a powerful invitation and a catalyst for awakening the inner scripture in the recipient. The inner scripture in the recipient is a dynamic, living power of truth that is meant to guide him in the circumstances of his life that he has to discover almost in the heat of the moment. So a great scripture, going back to the definition of many other scriptures that are there in the world, what the Gita is telling us is the great scripture is that which lends itself to the experience of a developing humanity. and evolving humanity by facilitating the connection with the infinite and eternal, who is beyond every scripture, who is beyond the sum total of all scriptures. So paradoxical as it may sound, Krishna as the avatar, and we'll get to the definition of an avatar at some point, if not today, sometime later, is not telling Arjuna, listen to me only, but he's saying, I represent a power of infinity, an infinite and eternal power. Through me, I am asking you to connect to that, because once you're connected to that, you are sorted, because that is living and dynamic by its very nature. So if you notice, those who have read the Gita, when Arjuna, like as Srikant said, constantly asks, tell me what the hell to do. I am confused. I am screwed up. I don't know what the hell to do. The charioteer does not tell him what to do. Arjuna is not told what to do, but is asked to make his own decision. But he is asked to do that after providing him a certain system of contextual knowledge that allows him to achieve the right commensurate station of consciousness from which the action or the right action will automatically and spontaneously flow. This is very important. Very often we find teachings and scriptures giving us, here is a prescription. But anybody who has been on the spiritual path worth its salt knows that unless there is a commensurate rapport, unless there is a commensurate bridge between your station of consciousness and the action that you take, you are going to fall flat. Because the station of consciousness determines the whole, your ontological status as a being, from which the spontaneity of action is a given. But if you try to ape that action from a suboptimal or a different state of consciousness, you're going to screw up. So that is the third very important point about the Gita in terms of its whole import and redefinition of what a scripture means. Fourth and final, and I can think of only these 4 points, there are others, but these 4, in my opinion, stand out tremendously. The fourth is that in general, other scriptures, in general, I'm not saying universally always, in general, especially the religious scriptures and the scriptures of institutionalized religion, without getting into names, we understand what we are saying. In general, most scriptures admit the possibility of having a relationship with the divine. Usually often based on fear and apprehension and etc., etc. But the Gita not only recognizes, but affirms the possibility of a total union with the divine to the point of becoming like him, which many other scriptures we know almost consider not only an impossibility, but a sacrilege. Yeah. Man is fallen, man is sinful from its genesis. He becoming the divine? Holy shit. Impossible. So Gita, there are these 3 terms, Sadrasya, Salokya, and Sayujya. Very important. The Sanskrit terms, I will explain. Sadrasya means becoming and climbing or ascending to the nature of the divine. Salokya is habitation, living with the divine as the lover, as the ultimate beloved. And Sayujya is total identity in the divine. But identity in the divine, not in terms of a total dissolution of the self, a total dissolution of the egoic self, but not the dissolution of the psychic inherent divine individuality, to the point I think Ambika was trying to refer to when she made her last point. So I am divine nature. I inhabit the spiritual world with the divine, and I am identified with him, yet maintaining a relation of difference with him, because that is the very nature of the Leela of creation. While I identify with the divine and adopt the divine nature, I am still expected to maintain the unique individuality which the divine has manifested me for. Otherwise, I would be a mathematico-ontological redundancy. So the Gita, the profound import of the Gita when it was delivered was that, if you look at all 4 points together, it was meant to lift humanity from a primarily religio-ethical stage, which is defined by rules and laws and norms and injunctions and to-dos and to-don'ts, to a spiritual stage where the full freedom of the spirit is achieved through a direct communion with the divine. And where the gradual movement from the ordinary karma yogin who identifies with the doer with a small d moves as an instrumentation of the divine, of the doer, which is universal nature, and finally an identification with the doer himself, who is the Lord of universal nature. Sarva dharma parityajya. So the charioteer tells Arjuna, let go of all dharmas, because when you connect with me, you don't need any other rules. So this whole spontaneous order point that Yasuhiko mentions in the omnicentric vision context is this. It's only me. Because ultimately, who is there? All of creation is only one conscious being. We are all becomings of the one conscious being. We think we are separate becomings. We are separate, and that's the whole egoic ignorance. There is only one conscious being. There is only one Purusha. The manifestation is nothing but a multiform play of an infinite game of the conscious being having fun with different forms of himself. But this has to move from a mental understanding to a spiritual realization. And that is the invitation of the Gita. The Gita is, to use a modern terminology, it is the market of one. The market of one, in the marketing parlance, mass customization. Every individual unique being has her own dharma, which is ruled by nobody else. No clan, no caste, no parent, no teacher, no friend, no community, no cult, nothing. The market of one served by the one, capital O, to become the one, capital O. Any questions before we move to the 2 guideline directions given by Yasuhiko?
Not a question, but I just wanted to add something Shrikant mentioned last night. You said the one, and again, it's that 0, the circle, back to the circle. Yeah.
Nilesh, that was brilliant. Can you do us a favor and just recap the 4 points again, very, very briefly, maybe 1 or 2 sentences?
The first point is that it is not delivered in a monastery, but in the middle of excruciating action. So it's action orientated like nobody's business. Number 2, it is delivered in the personal context of an intimate relationship to a deserving candidate only and nobody else. Because the import of the teaching is contingent on the nature of the recipient and his action as the representative of humanity as it's moved from one stage of evolution to the next. Third, not a static hand-me-down prescription, but meant to awaken the inner scripture to engineer a connection with the fount of everything. The numero uno, the supreme. Nothing else. Number 4, the ultimate possibility promised by the Gita is divine nature and identity with the divine, not a distant relationship of a disciple or a student or a sinful human, none of that. The promise is divine nature. The promise is the status and the operating leverage of the Purushottama. Those who have studied the Gita knows that there are 3 Purushas and all that. We won't get into that. But the ultimate Purusha, which is Purusha standing for the soul as opposed to nature, which is manifest creation. The ultimate status is the Purushottama, the Uttama Purusha, which is the one conscious being with a capital O, capital C, capital B.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, let's continue. Nilesh.
Okay. Now, Yasuhiko, your first question was, what does the Bhagavad Gita teach us with respect to being in the battlefield of and winning the eternal war? Now, what is the eternal war? And the way I see it, the eternal war is fundamentally between the higher nature and the lower nature. The eternal war is most acutely felt by man as a being who is in the process of transitioning from animal nature to divine nature. And because he is transitioning from animal nature to divine nature, the challenge, the enormity of the spiritual challenge is so excruciating that he perceives this journey as a war in the deepest esoteric sense. This war between the higher nature and the lower nature, between the divine nature and the animal nature, is both within and without, which in a way is also a war between what has been and what is wanting to emerge. That's another way of looking at it. Now, the genesis of this war has to be understood, or is the very mechanism of manifest creation itself. And it can be actually traced back to 2 fundamental issues at the very root. I'm talking the language of cosmogony now. The first issue is the movement of the one to the many. The first issue is the one to many movement of the fount of creation of the spirit into richly diversified multiplicity of manifest creation, where the one indivisible source apparently divides himself into innumerable forms and seemingly loses himself in the multiplicity. Every word is important. Seemingly losing himself in the multiplicity. The second issue is the emergence of the higher operating principles of manifest creation from the lower, and hence the dependence or subjection of a nested hierarchy of higher principles to the corresponding lower principles below them. a nested hierarchy of planar higher principles which almost as if there is a bidirectional arrow by which spirits manifests right up to matter, and matter seeks to emerge and evolve right towards spirit. This has been represented by that serpent eating its tail and all of that stuff in various esoteric literature. But the point is this, because the evolution proceeds from the mud, seemingly from the mud, from the filth, from the septic tank, the higher principles are held hostage by the lower. Life emerges from seeming dead matter, and the dynamism of life is subject to the dullness and rigidity of matter. Mind emerges from living matter, and its clarity is subject to the turbulence and craving of passions and life energies. Similarly, the spiritual ranges above the mind are subject to the mind's fragmentation and egological compulsions. So two primordial issues: the one-to-many movement into seeming independent separation, and the principle of the higher subject to and dependent on the lower having to painfully extricate itself out of that subjection to establish its sovereignty and then turn back and transform the lower. This is evolution. These two issues taken together present a very complex entanglement of ignorance, bondage, and error. In the scheme of things, we find ourselves in our evolutionary trajectory. So to the point about some recent emails, this war is not just between the good and the bad, between the responsibles and resentfuls, to use Yasuhiko's language, between the devas and the asuras, as is the terms used in Indian spiritual literature, but between the higher and lower nature. Because, and I think from a yogic perspective, it is better to view it as the latter than the former, because there is darkness hiding in the so-called responsibles also. I think Belinda mentioned to this in her email. And these openings, these gaps, these vulnerabilities of darkness in the responsibles are used by the resentfuls to exploit the situation. That's what is happening. Look at the world and the situation. A. Number B, there is also a vestige of hidden truth in the resentfuls, which have to be recovered and transformed. If there was no vestige of hidden truth in the resentful, they wouldn't exist. They wouldn't be causing so much of trouble. So once we begin to view this as higher nature and lower nature cuts across the resentfuls and the responsibles and this whole mass of neutral brainwashed people in the middle. It's everywhere. It cuts across. We are taking a different cut. But the yogic journey, it is useful to view it as a fight between higher and lower nature, because I and you and all of us have the immediate leverage to focus on this formation, to begin to extricate and do this distillation between the higher and lower nature. And once a certain level of self-perfection and distillation and chiseling and smelting has happened in this nature, only then there will come the genuine capacity of dealing with the lower nature without. You see, that is the understanding of the eternal war. Now, the teaching of the Gita is to detect and understand these issues and their interplay, from which all exoteric issues stem from. And when these two issues at their root are addressed, all the exoteric issues will dissolve and melt away. And anybody who has been in a rigorous and seriously committed spiritual path, you will find, we can testify to each other that when this level of commitment comes in, external circumstances seem to automatically diminish in severity. Not always, sometimes. And when this work is not done, and the whole focus is I want to resolve the problem of resentfuls and kill the resentfuls, the exact opposite happens. And there is a reason, there's an occult and mysterious reason for that. That is because there is bypassing happening in the commitment of the spiritual, commitment to spiritual perfection within ourselves. So the yoga of the Gita is an inside out process. It is a within to without process, not without to within. The entire human race is progressing towards this knowledge through its acute experience of ignorance. And that is the real evolution. The first station of ignorance we have is that I am this mind, emotion, and body. This is the first station of ignorance, albeit a necessary one at first. I am different from the other becomes I am separate from the other. And whenever there is the other, there is fear and there is greed. Fear and greed inevitably culminate into the principle of Shrikant's vectors on the other radially centrifugal directions. Whenever there is fear and greed, whenever that is lurking as a result of the separation, it culminates into the principle of domination, control, possession mania, and eventually predation. Pure predation. The eater eating is eaten. This is the vital egoic impulsiveness in whose swirl humanity is currently today. There is all-round mutual devouring, complete, utter, total predation. Those of us who are watching the terrible dance of the death cult in charge of the world today know what we are talking about here. We see this everywhere. We see this literally in the animal world, because that's the principle. The eater is eaten, and then he is eaten by somebody else. That is the whole energetic interchange in nature. As human beings, as long as we are in the lower animal nature, that is exactly what we will do. Not just in symbolic terms, there is cannibalism in the world of the death cult. Where does this stem from? The mental vital man's will to power. And this is not just Nietzsche. This whole recognition of the inevitability of war as a result of this mutual devouring and this consumptive mania of domination, control, and possession goes back right to Heraclitus, right to pre-Socratic days. Nietzsche just gave it a much more eloquent elaboration. So, to fully appreciate and understand this, not at a mental, but at the level of the being, one has to understand, among other things, the mysterious and complex relationship between the Purusha principle and the Prakriti principle in every instance of creation, in every fractal of creation. It has to be detected within us first, and that detection and understanding has to happen in the middle of life action, not in a monastery, even though it might be a temporary retreat, not just in silent contemplation, but in the middle of dynamic involvement and engagement with life. And in the middle of that, purification and self-mastery has to be achieved. The work requires the acquisition and assimilation of the right knowledge so as to be able to guide it, and devotion to the fount of knowledge with a capital F and power through a total and complete unconditional self-giving. For us to be able to effectuate Shrikant's diagram, this is necessity the first and the last word. Work, knowledge, and love as conventionally practiced have to be upgraded and uplifted to a higher working, for which one has to transcend the three lower modes of nature, three lower modes of Prakriti's working. They are called the three gunas. You will recollect from the reading. And the instrument for this journey, in terms of the parts of being, is the buddhi or the yoga of the intelligent will. But eventually, the intelligent will or the mind has to make way for the soul. It takes time to find the soul, but it has to be found and eventually allowed to take charge to discover one's swabhava and swadharma. So the Gita's viewpoint is different from many other religious doctrines. It posits that this war is necessary because for a greater good, a lesser good may have to be forsaken or given up. Ideally, we would want a win-win, but if that is not possibility, this whole business of passive nonviolence as a moral cop-out is often far worse than immediate direct violence against injustice. Why? Because this cop-out, it distorts and sets into motion a complex array of karmic and retributive forces in the occult economy of nature, which have tremendously far-reaching and deleterious consequences for a later age. And that's what we have been seeing for the last 2000 years. Love thy neighbor is all good. But if I have to kill thy neighbor, I have to do it. Do unto others as they would do unto myself is good. But if I see that they are a threat to humanity, that they are a threat to peace, if I have to slay, so be it. But I have to slay with love, not hatred. I have to slay from the station of the Purushottama, where the action has no karmic consequences because I am operating from the poise of the self. The spiritual law has to prevail over the moral law. That is the only way the eternal war can be fought, not just fought and won.
Very good. Very good, Neeraj.
Take a short pause before the second question, inner and outer freedom.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
If there are no questions, then we'll take it after I finish the second.
Yeah, go ahead. Others, there's inner and outer freedom.
So your question, Yashiko, was that what does the Bhagavad Gita teach us with respect to the achievement of inner and outer freedom? Obviously, that's very relevant to this course and the previous course. And the way I see it, the teaching of the Gita is that inner freedom is the foundation of outer freedom, and not the other way around. Just as stillness is the foundation of movement, unity is the foundation of multiplicity, equality is the foundation of difference, and impartiality the foundation of appropriate action. In the middle of this teaching, many apparent contradictions between mutability and immutability, personality and impersonality, featurelessness and infinite featured, form and formless are resolved and harmonized at a higher level of perception and consciousness. Now, the inner freedom, the pursuit and the achievement of inner freedom being a necessary precursor and condition for the outer freedom, entails the recovery of the Purusha over Prakriti. What is Purusha? Consciousness. What is Prakriti? Energy. Very important we understand this. The sovereignty of the knower of the field over the field itself. The sovereignty of the being over the becoming. The sovereignty of the sanctioner and the enjoyer and the witness over the action that he authorizes, allows, sanctions, or refuses to sanction. This principle has to be understood and internalized and metabolized at the level of our being. There is no other way for inner freedom. But since the self, small s, is the microcosm has the same constitutional structure of the cosmos, winning the inner battle is the only sustainable and assured basis of winning the outer battle. So the divine has created us in a structure in the cosmic scheme of things where the yoga is not just possible, but inevitable. And the more the threat of outer freedom, as the extrinsic world is showing us over the last 20 years in general and over the last 2 years in particular, we have to remember that only the Swarat can be the Samrat. What does that mean? Swarat means the self-ruler. Only the self-ruler can be the world ruler. So this teaching is an inside-out job as well as a top-down one. If you think of the planes of existence and the nested hierarchy of consciousness. And therefore the focus from the Gita's teaching, the focus shifts from the what of the action to the how of the action. Please kill. But if you kill from the inferior consciousness, the karmic impact is horrendous. If you kill from the right station of consciousness, that is divine action. So said differently, the teaching of the Gita is that the soul state is far more important than the action itself, which is the earlier point we raised about the commensurate nature of the consciousness and the work. Now, when the existing edifice of existing knowledge and virtue is shattered, as is the case with Arjuna, a new dharma, a new system of thought and values is required to assuage the anguished being, which is Arjuna, failing which he will disintegrate. Looking at the current state of the world today, in the context of this conversation we are having today, I think we are reaching that same point. With the way the dance of the death cult holding sway on every aspect of our life, every institution in the corporate existence of the world, if this inside-out war is not initiated and won now, we may not survive. This is not just a coffee room chat. Today, there is no place to hide, as was in the case with Arjuna. There is no option to rationalize, nor will suppression do. All the dark secrets have to be shed in the light of discrimination and a purified understanding. The Gita goes beyond love thy neighbor, withdraw into nirvanic emptiness, or even devotional bliss and merger with the Lord of the Vaishnava philosophy of India. Because Krishna is not just the flute. Krishna is also the Sudarshan Chakra. This is what the ISKCON establishment have forgotten. Conveniently. So in practical terms, what does this mean? It means the highest level of purification, self-mastery, and self-perfection to become the appropriate container for the divine action. And this means that not only can we change, Yasuhiko, I think, used in one of our earlier talks, you may be inside prison, but you can still be free. Viktor Frankl.
Yes.
He is free in the concentration camp, in Auschwitz or Treblinka or wherever it was. So when the inner battle is won, not only can my response or reaction to the outer circumstances change, but the circumstances themselves. The conventional exoteric world takes the opposite approach. Rules, laws, systems, declarations, policies, which is all good. But if it is done without a commensurate change in consciousness, character, and a transmutation of the dark and hidden and shameful nether regions of our own nature, of our subconscious, it ain't going to sustain. It ain't going to work properly, or it ain't going to sustain.
Yes.
The esoteric approach, unlike the exoteric approach, understands, feels, meets, and navigates the slew of the entire range of cosmic forces at work behind the scenes, deals with them,
Yes.
conquers them in oneself, and helps others to do so.
Very good.
And it is only then that it can make a switch in the needle at the world level. And this esoteric inner battle is often more intense and more difficult because there is no place to hide, no recourse to convenient explanations or moral posturing, no opportunities for comfortable distractions. As Arjuna realizes to his mortification in the middle of the battlefield.
Very good, Neeraj. We want to take a break until 11:45.